Hello, and welcome back to Miss Bell's channel. So today what we're going to be doing is listening to some mysteries, some unsolved mysteries. And so the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Lindenberg kidnapping. And then I'm going to talk about the Amelia Earhart case and how she went missing. So I hope that you enjoy this video. So Charles Augustus Lindenberg Jr., the 20-month-old son of the famous aviator, and Anne Morrow Lindenberg, was kidnapped about 9 p.m. on March 1st, 1832, from the nursery on the second floor of the Lindenberg home near Hopewell, New Jersey. The child's absence was discovered and reported to his parents, who were then at home, at approximately 10 p.m. by the child's nurse, Betty Gow. A search of the premises was immediately made, and a ransom note demanding $50,000 was found by the child's nurse. And that was found on the nursery window sill. After the Hopewell police were notified, the report was telephoned to the New Jersey State Police, who assumed charge of the investigation. During the search at the kidnapping scene, traces of mud were found on the floor in the nursery. Footprints impossible to measure were found under the nursery window. 2 sections of the ladder had been used in reaching the window. One of the 2 sections was split or broken where it joined the other, indicating that the ladder had broken during the ascent or descent. There were no blood stains in or about the nursery, nor were there any fingerprints. Household and estate employees were questioned and investigated. Colonel Lindenberg asked his friends to communicate with the kidnappers, and they made widespread appeals for the kidnappers to start negotiations. Various underworld characters were dealt with in attempts to contact the kidnappers, and numerous clues were advanced and exhausted. A second ransom note was received by Colonel Lindenberg on March 6, 1932, and they had increased the price to $70,000. A police conference was then called by the governor at Trenton, New Jersey, which was attended by prosecuting officials, police authorities, and government representatives. Various theories and policies of procedure were discussed. Private investigators also were employed by Colonel Lindenberg's attorney, Colonel Henry Breckinridge. So there was a third ransom note as well, which was received by Colonel Lindenberg's attorney on March 8th. That an intermediary appointed by the Lindenbergs would not be accepted, and requesting a note in a newspaper. On the same date, Dr. John F. Condon, Bronx, New York City, a retired school principal, published in the Bronx Home News an offer to act as go-between and pay an additional $1,000 ransom. The following day, the 4th ransom note was received by Dr. Condon, which indicated he would be acceptable as a go-between. This was approved by Colonel Lindenberg. About March 10, 1932, Dr. Condon received $70,000 in ransom and immediately started negotiations for payment through newspaper columns using the codename Jaffe. About 8:30 p.m. on March 12th, after receiving an anonymous telephone call, Dr. Condon received the 5th ransom note, delivered by Joseph Perrone, a taxicab driver, who received it from an unidentified stranger. The message stated that another note would be found beneath a stone in a vacant stand, 100 feet from an outlying subway station. This note, the 6th, was found by Condon. As indicated, following instructions therein, the doctor met an unidentified man who called himself John at Woodlawn Cemetery near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue. They discussed payment of the ransom money. The stranger agreed to furnish a token of the child's identity. Condon was accompanied by a bodyguard, except while talking to John during the next few days, Dr. Condon repeated his advertisements, urging further contact and stating his willingness to pay the ransom. A baby sleeping suit as a token of identity and a 7th ransom note were received by Dr. Condon. On March 16th, the suit was delivered to Colonel Lindenberg and later identified. Condon continued his advertisements. The 8th ransom note was received by Condon on March 21st, insisting on complete compliance and advising that the kidnapping had been planned for a year. On March 29th, Betty Gow, the Lindenberg nurse, found the infant's thumb guard, worn at the time of the kidnapping, near the entrance of the estate. The following day, the 9th ransom note was received by Condon, threatening to increase the demand to $100,000 and refusing a code for use in newspaper columns. The 10th ransom note, received again by Dr. Condon on April 1st, 1932, instructed him to have the money ready the following night, to which Condon replied by an ad in the press. The 11th ransom note was delivered to Condon on April 2nd, 1932, by an unidentified taxi driver who said he received it from an unknown man. Dr. Condon found the 12th ransom note under a stone in front of a greenhouse at 3225 East Tremont Avenue, Bronx, New York, as instructed in the 11th note. Shortly thereafter, on the same evening, by following instructions contained in the 12th note, Condon again met whom he believed to be John, to reduce the demand to $50,000. This amount was handed to the stranger in exchange for a receipt and the 13th note, containing instructions to the fact that the kidnapped child could be found on a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The stranger then walked north into the park woods. The following day, an unsuccessful search for the baby was made near Martha's Vineyard. Then the search later repeated. Dr. Condon was positive that he would recognize John if he ever saw him again. On May 12, 1932, the body of the kidnapped baby was accidentally found, partially buried and badly decomposed, about 4.5 miles southeast of the Lindenberg home, 45 feet from the highway near Mount Rose, New Jersey in Mercer County. The discovery was made by William Allen, the assistant on a truck driven by Orville Wilson. The head was crushed, there was a hole in the skull, and some of the body members were missing. The body was positively identified and cremated at Trenton, New Jersey on May 13, 1932. The coroner's examination showed that the child had been dead for about 2 months and death was caused by a blow in the head. So after the body was found, they started the investigation. So that went on for about 2 years. So on March 2nd, 1932, after a conference with Attorney General FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, had contacted the headquarters of the New Jersey State Police at Trenton, New Jersey. He officially informed the organization that the U.S. Department of Justice could afford Colonel H. Norman Schatzquap, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, the superintendent of the New Jersey State Police, the assistance and cooperation of the FBI bringing in the apprehension of the parties responsible for the kidnapping. He advised the New Jersey State Police that they could call upon the Bureau for any facilities or resources which the latter might be capable of extending. The special agent in charge of the New York City office of the Bureau, which at the time covered the New Jersey district, was instructed accordingly, and upon instructions from the director, the special agent in charge communicated with New Jersey State Police and the New York Police, offering any assistance which the Bureau might be able to lend in this matter. So during the next few weeks, the Bureau was acting merely in an auxiliary capacity, so there being no federal jurisdiction. However, on May 13th, 1932, the President directed that all government investigate agencies should place themselves at the disposal of the state of New Jersey, and that the FBI should serve as a clearinghouse and coordinating agency for all investigations in this case conducted by federal investigate units. So on May 23, 1932, the FBI in New York City informed banks in Greater New York that the Bureau was with the coordinating agency for all governmental activity in the case. A close watch for ransom money was requested. So the New Jersey State Police announced May 26, 1932, the offer of a reward not to exceed $25,000 for any information resulting in the apprehension and conviction of the kidnapper or kidnappers, in compliance with the request made by Colonel Schwarzkopf. Copies of this notice of reward were forwarded to the FBI, to all law enforcement officials and agencies throughout the United States. On June 10, 1932, Violet Sharp, a waitress in the home of Mrs. Lindenberg's mother, Mrs. Dwight Morrill, who had been under investigation by authorities, committed suicide by swallowing poison where she was about to be re-questioned. However, her movements on the night of March 1st, 1932 had been carefully checked, and it was soon definitely certain that she had no connection with the abduction. In September 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated in a meeting with Director Hoover that all the work in the case be centralized in the Department of Justice. He requested the director to convey his views to the Attorney General Cummings with the suggestion that the Attorney General make a request of the Commissioner of the IRS, either through the President or directly, for a detailed report of all the work performed by the IRS Intelligence Unit. On October 19, 1933, it was officially announced that the FBI would have exclusive jurisdiction insofar as the federal government was concerned in handling any investigative features of the case. So the President's proclamation requiring the return of treasury of all gold and gold certificates was a valuable aid in the case. And as much as 40,000 of the ransom money had been paid in gold certificates. And at the time of the proclamation, a large portion of this money was known to be outstanding. Therefore, this phase of the investigation was emphasized. On January 17th, a circular letter was issued by the New York City Bureau Office to all banks and their branches in New York City, requesting an extremely close watch for ransom certificates. In February 1934, all Bureau offices were supplied with copies of the Bureau's revisited pamphlet containing the serial numbers of the ransom bills. So the New York City Bureau office distributed this to all of their employees handling currency in banks, clearinghouses, grocery stores, and certain selected communities, insurance companies, gas stations, airports, department stores, post offices, and any company in that area. So after the distribution of these booklets containing the serial number of the ransom currency, there were also prepared and similarly distributed by the Bureau currency key cards in which set forth the inclusive serial numbers of all ransom notes which had been paid. So this was followed by frequent personal contacts with bank officials and individual employees in an effort to keep alive their interest. So prior to this time, the passing of ransom bills had been reported to either the FBI, the New Jersey State Police, or the New York City Police Department, none of which had complete information at this point. So therefore, arrangements were effected whereby investigation of all ransom bills detected in the future could be immediately conducted jointly by representatives of 3 interested agencies. So on March 4th, 1932, a con man named Gaston B. Means was approached by Miss Evelyn Walsh McLean of Washington, D.C., who felt that she might be of material assistance to Colonel Lindenberg in helping with the return of his child. Mrs. McLean had become acquainted with Means as a result of some investigative work which Means had performed for her husband some years before. Means informed her that he felt certain he could secure a contact with kidnappers inasmuch as he had been invited to participate in a big kidnapping some weeks before but had declined. So Means claimed that his friend was responsible for the Lindenberg kidnapping. The following day, Means reported to Miss McLean that he had made contact with the person who had the child. He successfully induced Miss McLean to hand him over $100,000 to be used in paying the ransom, which he had been doubled. Until April 17, 1932, he kept Miss McLean waiting daily, expecting the return of the child. During this period, he was effecting negotiations with the alleged leader of the kidnappers, whom he called the Fox. Mrs. McLean finally requested the return of the $100,000 and additional money which she had advanced for him for expenses. When he failed to do so, the case was turned over to the FBI. Means and the Fox, who was found to be Norman T. Whittaker, a disbarred Washington attorney, were apprehended, and Means was later convicted of embezzlement and larceny after trust and sentenced to serve 15 years in a federal jail. Whittaker and Means were later convicted of conspiracy to defraud and were sentenced to serve 2 years each in a federal jail. So there were other attempted frauds which required extensive investigations before they could be completely eliminated from the consideration in the connection of the Lindenberg case. So there were literally thousands of leads in all sections of the United States. So the results of all these investigations, no matter how trivial, were reported. The activities of the known and suspected members of the Purple Gang of Detroit and various rumors and allegations concerning this gang were carefully and thoroughly investigated. Numerous registries of boats were examined and fruitless endeavor to locate boat Nellie, on which the baby was to have been found according to the 13th ransom. So records of cemetery employees who were employed in various cemeteries in certain sections of New York City and near Hopewell, New Jersey, were examined. Information accumulated in various other kidnapping and extortion cases handled by the FBI was examined in closest detail and studied with particular reference to any bearing of they might have been the solution to the Lindenberg case. Hundreds of photographs and descriptive data of known criminals of all types of other possible suspects were exhibited to the few eyewitnesses in the case to identify the mysterious John. On May 2nd, 1933, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York discovered 296 $10 gold certificates and one $20 gold certificate, all Lindenberg ransom notes. These bills were included among currency received at the Federal Reserve Bank on May 1st, 1933, and apparently had been made in one deposit. Immediately upon the discovery of these bills, deposit tickets at the Federal Reserve Bank for May 1st, 1933 were examined. One was found bearing the name and address of J.J. Faulkner at 537 West 149th Street, and he had marked thereon gold certificates, 10 and 20, in the amount of $2,980. Despite extensive investigation, this depositor was never located. Examination of the ransom notes by handwriting experts resulted in virtually a unanimous opinion that all the notes were written by the same person and that the writer was of German nationality, but had spent some time in America. Dr. Gordon described John as Scandinavian, and believing he could identify the man, spent considerable time in viewing the numerous photographs of possible suspects and known criminals. In this connection, the FBI retained the services of an artist to prepare a portrait of John from descriptions furnished by Dr. Condon and Joseph Perrone, a taxi cab driver who delivered one of the ransom letters to Dr. Condon. And in a further endeavor to identify the individual who received the ransom payment, representatives of New York City Bureau Office engaged Dr. Condon to prepare a transcript of all conversations he had by him with John on March 12th and April 2nd, 1932, the dates on which Mr. Condon personally contacted the kidnapper in order to negotiate the return of the child and payment of the ransom. These conversations were during March 1934. Transcribed in detail, the records by Dr. Condon, who imitated the pronunciations and dialect of John. In this manner, the nationality, education, mentality, and character of the kidnapper were more clearly defined and permanently preserved for future use. Another interesting attempt to identify the kidnapper centered around the ladder used in the crime. Police quickly realized that it was crudely built, but built nonetheless by someone familiar with wood who was mechanically inclined. The ladder had been thoroughly examined for fingerprints and had been exhibited to builders, carpenters, and neighbors of the Lindenbergs in vain. Slivers of the ladder even had been analyzed, and the types of wood used in the ladder had been identified as well. So perhaps a complete investigation or examination of the ladder by itself by a wood expert would yield additional clues. And in early 1933, an expert called Arthur Kohler of the Forest Service was able to do that. So Kohler disassembled the ladder and identified the types of wood used and examined tool marks. He also looked at the pattern made by nail holes, for it appeared that some of the wood had been used before in an indoor construction. Kohler made field trips to the Lindenberg estates and to factories to trace some of the wood. He summarized his findings in a report and later played a critical role in the trial of the kidnapper. So for a period of 7 months prior to August 20th, 1934, no gold certificates were discovered except for those received in the Federal Reserve Bank, previously mentioned. Starting August 20th, 1934, and extending into September, a total of 16 gold certificates were discovered, most of them in the vicinity of Yorkville and Harlem. The long-awaited opportunity had finally arrived. As each bill was recovered, a colored pin marking the location of the recovered bill was inserted in a large map of the metropolitan area, thus indicating the movements of the individual or the individuals who might be passing the ransom money. When the first few made their appearance, it was decided to concentrate on gold certificates, as experience had proven the futility of tracing in the ordinary currency and included in the ransom money. Keeping the cooperative policy previously established with the New Jersey State Police and New York City Police Department. Teams composed of a representative of each of these police agencies and a special agent of the Bureau were organized to personally contact all banks in Greater New York and Westchester County. As a result, the various neighborhood banks discovered the bills close to the point at which they were passed. And then it became possible for the investigators to trace the bills to the person who had originally passed them. For the first time in history of this case, the investigators succeeded in finding the description of the individual passing of these bills that fit exactly the description of John, as described by Dr. Condon. It was determined, though, through the investigation that the bills were being passed principally at the corner produce stores. About 1:20 p.m. on September 18, 1934, the assistant manager of the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Company at 125th Street Park Avenue, New York City, telephoned New York City Bureau Office to advise that a $10 gold certificate had been discovered a few minutes previously by one of the tellers at the bank. It was soon ascertained that this bill had been received at the bank from a gasoline station located at 127th Street, Lexington Avenue, New York City. On September 15, 1934, an alert attendant had received a bill in payment for 5 gallons of gasoline from a man whose description fit closely to that of the individual who had passed other bills in recent weeks. The filling station attendant, being suspicious of the $10 gold certificate, recorded on the bill license number of the automobile driven by the purchaser. The license number was issued to Bruno Richard Hopman of New York City, Bronx, New York. Hopton's house was closely surveyed by federal and local authorities throughout the night of September 18, 1934. Until approximately 9 a.m. on September 19, 1934, an individual closely fitting the description of John, as supplied by Dr. Condon, and the description of the purchaser of the gasoline, as supplied by the service station attendant, left his house and entered his automobile parked nearby. He was promptly taken into custody by representatives of 3 interested agencies. After some investigating, he was found to be Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the individual to whom the automobile license had been issued, a German carpenter who had been in this country for approximately 11 years. A $20 gold ransom certificate was found on him as person. His description fit perfectly of that John described by Dr. Condon. And in his house was found a pair of shoes which had been purchased with the $20 ransom bill recovered on September 8, 1934. Hauptmann admitted several other purchases which had been made with ransom certificates. On the night of September 19, 1934, he was positively identified by Joseph Perron as the individual whom had received the 5th ransom note to be delivered to Dr. Condon. The following day, ransom certificates in excess of 13,000 were found secreted in the garage of Hauptmann's residence. Shortly after, he was identified by Dr. Condon as John, to whom the ransom had been paid to. It was also certain that he was in possession of a Dodge sedan automobile, which answered the description of that seen in the vicinity of the Lindenberg home the day prior to the kidnapping. Shortly after his apprehension, specimens of Hauptmann's handwriting were flown to Washington, D.C., where a study was made of them in the FBI laboratory. So further investigation developed. Hauptmann, 35 years old, was a native of Germany. He had a criminal record for robbery and had already spent time in prison. Early July 1923, he stowed away aboard the SS Hanover at Bremen, Germany, and arrived in the port of New York City on July 13, 1923. He was arrested and deported immediately. After another failed attempt entry in August, Hauptmann successfully entered the United States in November 1923 on the board of George Washington. On October 10, 1925, Hauptmann married Anna Schoeffer, a New York City waitress. A son, Manfred, was born to them in 1933. During his illegal stay in New York City, and until the spring of 1932, Hauptmann followed his occupation of carpenter. However, a short while after March 1, 1932, the date of the kidnapping, Hauptmann began to trade rather extensively in stocks and never worked again. So Hauptmann was indicted in the Supreme Court, Bronx County, New York, on charges of extortion on September 26, 1934, and on October 8, 1934, in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, he was indicted for murder. 2 days later, the governor of the state of New York honored the requisition of the governor of the state of New Jersey for the surrender of Bruno Richard Hauptmann, and on October 19, 1934, he was removed to the Hunterdon County Jail, Flemington, New Jersey, to await trial. So the trial of John Hauptmann began on January 3, 1935 at Flemington, New Jersey, and lasted 5 weeks. The case against him was based on the circumstantial evidence. Tool marks on the ladder matched tools he owned by Hauptmann. Wood in the ladder was found to match wood used in his flooring in his attic. So Dr. Condon's telephone number and address were found scrawled on a door frame inside a closet in his house. Handwriting on the ransom notes matched samples of Hauptmann's handwriting as well. So on February 13, 1935, the jury returned a verdict. Hauptmann was guilty of the murder in first degree, and the sentence was death. The defense appealed. So the Supreme Court of the state of New Jersey on October 9, 1935, upheld the verdict of the lower court. Hauptmann's appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States was denied on December 9, 1935, and he was to be electrocuted on January 17, 1936. However, on the same day, the governor of the state of New York granted a 30-day reprieve, and on February 17, 1936, Hauptmann was resentenced to be electrocuted during the week of March 30, 1936. On March 30, 1936, the pardon court of the state of New Jersey denied Hopman's petition for clemency, and on April 3rd, 1936, at 8:47 p.m., Bruno Richard Hopman was electrocuted. So that is the story of the Lindenberg kidnapping, and this story was found on the FBI website, so that is the story where I got it from. So I hope that you enjoyed that story, and it looks like that's all that I have time for today. But hopefully I can do another series if you guys enjoy this. I will see you later. Goodbye.